My daughter-in-law bought a new farm and handed me the mortgage papers. You'll probably die soon. Pay our bills while you still can. I said no, and the shrew sued me for $380,000. In court, the judge asked just one question. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and comment the city you're watching from. I should have known something was wrong the moment Lucy called asking for lunch. In 12 years of marriage to my son David, she'd never once suggested we spend time together alone. Our relationship had always been polite but distant. The kind where we exchanged pleasantries at family gatherings and nothing more. "Phyllis, I was thinking we should catch up," she'd said over the phone, her voice unusually sweet. "Just the two of us. I could come over Tuesday around noon." I'd been so surprised that I agreed without thinking. Maybe she was finally ready to build a real relationship. Maybe becoming a mother had changed her perspective on family. God knows I'd been hoping for years that we could find some common ground. Tuesday morning, I spent extra time preparing. I made her favorite chicken salad, though I wasn't even sure it was still her favorite, and set the dining room table with my good china. The autumn sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, casting gentle patterns across the polished wood. Everything looked perfect, warm, welcoming. Lucy arrived exactly at noon, dressed in one of those expensive outfits that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a sleek ponytail, and she carried a large leather portfolio under her arm. Even her smile seemed different, sharper somehow. "Phyllis, thank you so much for having me," she said, kissing my cheek with lips that felt cold despite the warm day. We made small talk during lunch. She complimented the chicken salad, asked about my garden, mentioned how busy David had been at work. Normal conversation, though I noticed she barely touched her food. I kept waiting for her to bring up the grandchildren, but she didn't mention Emma or little Jake once. After I cleared the plates, Lucy reached for her portfolio. "Actually, Phyllis, there's something important I wanted to discuss with you." My heart lifted. Maybe she wanted advice about the children, or perhaps she was planning a surprise for David's birthday. "Of course, dear. What is it?" She pulled out a thick stack of papers and spread them across my dining room table like she was dealing cards. "These are the mortgage documents for our new farm property, the one we've been looking at in Millerville." I leaned forward, confused. I knew they'd been house hunting, but I didn't understand why she was showing me mortgage papers. "It looks like a lovely property from the photos David showed me." Lucy's smile grew wider, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It is lovely. 15 acres, a renovated farmhouse, a barn for the children to play in. Perfect for raising a family. I'm sure you'll be very happy there," I said, still not understanding where this was going. That's when Lucy's expression changed completely. The fake warmth drained from her face, replaced by something cold and calculating. "Well, Phyllis, here's the thing. We need you to take over the mortgage payments." I blinked, certain I'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" "The mortgage payments. We've already signed the papers, but we need someone to handle the financial responsibility." She tapped the documents with one perfectly manicured finger. "We figured you could take care of it." My mouth went dry. "Lucy, I don't understand. Why would I pay for your house?" She leaned back in her chair, studying me like I was a particularly slow child. "Because, Phyllis, let's be realistic here. You're 64 years old. You don't have that much time left." The words hit me like a physical blow. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles turning white. "What did you just say to me?" "I'm just being practical," Lucy continued, her voice matter of fact. "You're getting older. You live alone in this big house, and honestly, what else are you going to do with your money? You should die in peace knowing you helped secure your grandchildren's future." I stared at her, speechless. The woman sitting across from my dining room table, the woman who'd just eaten my chicken salad, who'd kissed my cheek, who was the mother of my grandchildren, was telling me I should pay for her house because I was going to die soon anyway. "Lucy," I managed to whisper, "I can't believe you just said that to me." She shrugged. "I'm just being honest. Most people our age appreciate honesty. Besides, it's not like you need the money for anything important." "Our age." I stood up so quickly my chair scraped against the floor. "You're 32 years old, Lucy. I'm not even retired yet." "Okay, fine, but still." The mortgage is only $3,000 a month. You can afford it. $3,000 a month. I did quick math in my head. $36,000 a year. And mortgages usually ran 30 years. She was asking me to commit over $1 million because I was going to die soon anyway. Absolutely not, I said, my voice shaking with anger and disbelief. I will not pay for your house. Lucy's face hardened. That's disappointing, Phyllis. David said you'd be more family-oriented than this. David knows about this? Of course he knows. Whose idea do you think it was? That was the moment my heart truly broke. Not just because of Lucy's cruelty, but because my own son, the boy I'd raised, sacrificed for, loved unconditionally, was part of this scheme to exploit me. Lucy began gathering her papers with sharp, angry movements. Well, if you're going to be selfish about it, I guess we'll have to explore other options. Other options? She stood up, slinging her portfolio over her shoulder. Legal options. You've made promises to this family, Phyllis. David has witnesses who can testify to conversations you've had about supporting us financially. I felt dizzy. What conversations? I never promised to buy you a house. That's not how David remembers it. And honestly, if you're not willing to help voluntarily, maybe a judge should decide what your family obligations really are. She walked toward my front door, then turned back with that cold smile. Think about it, Phyllis. Think about whether you want to see your grandchildren again. Think about whether you want to be remembered as the grandmother who chose money over family. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving me standing in my dining room surrounded by the remnants of what I'd hoped would be a pleasant lunch. The autumn sunlight still streamed through the curtains, but the warmth had gone out of the day. I sank back into my chair, staring at the space where those mortgage papers had been spread across my table like a death sentence. Lucy's words echoed in my mind. You should die in peace knowing you helped secure your grandchildren's future. But what scared me most wasn't her cruelty. It was the realization that she meant every word. And apparently, so did my son. The papers arrived 3 weeks later, delivered by a stern-faced courier who made me sign for them like I was accepting my own execution warrant. The envelope was thick, official, with the letterhead of Morrison, Crawford and Associates emblazoned across the top in gold lettering. I sat at my kitchen table, my coffee growing cold as I read the words that would change everything. Complaint for breach of oral contract and unjust enrichment. Lucy Morrison versus Phyllis Hartwell. Amount sought, $380,000. $380,000. I read the number 3 times before it truly sank in. Lucy wasn't just asking for the mortgage payments anymore. She was demanding everything I had. The lawsuit painted me as a monster. According to the carefully crafted legal language, I was a wealthy widow who had made repeated verbal promises to support my son's family financially. I had allegedly encouraged them to purchase the farm property with assurances that I would handle the payments. I had supposedly committed to being their financial safety net and was now reneging on my moral and legal obligations. Every paragraph was a masterpiece of manipulation, twisting innocent conversations into binding contracts, turning my love for my family into legal liability. Lucy had taken moments like Christmas morning, when I joked about spoiling the grandkids, and transformed them into evidence of my financial commitment. What hurt most was seeing David's name on the witness list. My own son was prepared to testify against me in court. I called him that evening, my hands shaking as I dialed his number. Mom. His voice sounded tired, distant. David, I just received the lawsuit papers. Please tell me you're not really part of this. A long pause. Mom, Lucy feels like you led us on. We made that purchase based on your promises. What promises? When did I ever promise to buy you a house? You said you wanted to help us build a future for the kids. You said family should take care of family. I pressed my palm against my forehead, feeling a headache building. David, saying I want to help and promising to pay your mortgage are 2 completely different things. Are they? Because Lucy has been telling everyone about your commitment to us. She's embarrassed that you're backing out now. Embarrassed. My voice rose despite my efforts to stay calm. She told me I should pay because I'm going to die soon. Mom, don't be dramatic. She was just pointing out the practical reality. The practical reality. Those words hit me like ice water. My son thought it was practical to expect me to pay for his family's lifestyle because I might die before them. David, do you understand what this lawsuit means? She's asking for $380,000. That's my entire retirement savings. Maybe if you'd been more upfront from the beginning, it wouldn't have come to this. I hung up before I said something I'd regret forever. Within days, the whispers started. Our small town of Millaville thrived on gossip, and news of the lawsuit spread like wildfire. Lucy had been busy before filing the papers, laying groundwork with carefully placed conversations. At the grocery store, my neighbor Helen avoided eye contact. At the post office, the clerk who usually chatted about the weather suddenly became very interested in her paperwork. The woman who'd cut my hair for 15 years asked if I was having family troubles, with an expression that suggested she already knew the answer. The worst part was the story Lucy had crafted. According to the version making rounds through town, I was a well-off widow sitting on a pile of money while my poor son and his family struggled. I was selfish, out of touch, the kind of older person who hoarded wealth while younger generations suffered. She promised to help them buy that beautiful farm. I overheard someone saying at the library. Now she's pretending she never said it. Those poor children. I wanted to scream that it wasn't true, that I lived on a modest fixed income, that the money they thought I was hoarding was everything I had left for my own future. But who would believe me over a young mother with children and a sob story? Lucy had been strategic about her witnesses too. She'd convinced David's cousin Margaret that I'd made financial commitments at the last family reunion. She'd gotten our neighbor Bob to remember conversations where I allegedly discussed investing in the family's future. Each witness had a different piece of the puzzle, and together they painted a picture of a woman who'd made clear promises and was now breaking them. My sister Carol called from Phoenix, her voice tight with concern. "Phyllis, what's going on up there?" Margaret called and said, "You're being sued by Lucy." "It's complicated, Carol. She says you promised to buy them a house and now you're backing out." Even my own sister was getting the twisted version. "That's not what happened." "Then what did happen? Because from what I'm hearing, it sounds like you made promises you can't keep." I tried to explain, but the story Lucy had crafted was simpler, more believable than the truth. A grandmother promises to help, then changes her mind. It fit neatly into people's expectations and prejudices about family obligations and generational wealth. The isolation was crushing. 40 years I'd lived in this town, raised my son here, been part of this community. Now I was the villain in my own life story. I hired an attorney, Robert Chun, a young man fresh out of law school who was the only one I could afford. He read through the lawsuit with growing concern. "Mrs. Hartwell, I have to ask, did you ever tell them you'd help financially?" I said I wanted to help them build a good life. I said families should support each other. But I never promised to buy them a house. Unfortunately, oral contracts can be binding, especially if there are witnesses who can testify to specific promises. But I didn't make specific promises. Robert looked uncomfortable. The problem is proving that. It becomes a question of credibility, and you're facing multiple witnesses who claim otherwise. I spent that night lying awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering how my life had become this nightmare. Lucy had orchestrated everything perfectly. The timing, the witnesses, the narrative. She'd turned my love for my family into a weapon against me. But what terrified me most was the growing realization that she might actually win. In 3 weeks, I'd gone from being a grandmother who wanted the best for her family to a defendant facing financial ruin. And somewhere in the darkness of that sleepless night, I began to understand that this wasn't just about money. This was about power, control, and a daughter-in-law who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. The only question now was whether I had the strength to fight back. Robert Chin's office was smaller than my bedroom, tucked away on the second floor of an old brick building downtown. Law books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, and his desk was buried under stacks of case files. When I arrived for our second meeting, he looked like he hadn't slept much either. "Mrs. Hartwell, I've been going through the witness statements," he said, pushing his glasses up his nose. "I have to be honest with you. This is going to be challenging." I settled into the uncomfortable chair across from his desk. "Challenging how?" "They have 4 people willing to testify that you made specific financial commitments. Margaret says you told her at the family reunion that you plan to invest substantially in David's future. Bob claims you said you wanted to make sure the grandchildren had everything they needed, no matter the cost. And there are 2 others with similar statements. My stomach dropped. But that's not what I meant. When I said I wanted to invest in David's future, I was talking about maybe helping with the kids' college funds someday. When I said the grandchildren should have everything they needed, I meant love and support, not that I'd buy them a farm. Robert nodded sympathetically. I believe you, Mrs. Hartwell. But in court, intent can be difficult to prove. The question becomes whether a reasonable person could interpret your words as financial promises. What about Lucy's behavior? The way she demanded I pay because I'm going to die soon? Doesn't that prove she's manipulative? It helps establish her character, but it doesn't necessarily invalidate the contract claim. We need something more concrete. I spent the next week feeling like I was drowning. Every day brought new humiliations. At the bank, the teller who'd known me for years looked at me with suspicion when I tried to withdraw money for Robert's retainer. At church, conversations stopped when I walked into the fellowship hall. Even my mail carrier, usually friendly, now just dropped the mail and hurried away. The worst part was how isolated I felt from my own family. David hadn't called since our disastrous conversation. When I tried reaching out to my daughter-in-law's sister, hoping for some support, she told me coolly that Lucy was just protecting her family's interests. But then something unexpected happened. I was at home, going through my late husband Frank's papers for the 100th time, looking for anything that might help my case, when I found something I'd completely forgotten about. Hidden in the back of Frank's filing cabinet, behind folders of old tax returns, was a manila envelope labeled, Estate Matters Private. Inside were documents I'd never seen before. A separate will, trust papers, and correspondence with an attorney I didn't recognize. My hands trembled as I read Frank's handwriting on a letter dated just months before his death. I want to ensure Phyllis has complete financial security independent of any family obligations. The main estate should go to David as planned, but the trust funds should remain solely under Phyllis's control. There was more. Frank had established a separate trust worth nearly $200,000, specifically designated for my care and independent living. He'd been worried, according to his notes, about potential family pressure on me to share beyond my means. The next document made my breath catch. It was a letter from Frank to an attorney, expressing concerns about Lucy's influence on David. I've observed troubling patterns in how she approaches family finances. I want to ensure my wife is protected from any future manipulation or undue pressure. Frank had seen it. Even before I had, he'd recognized Lucy's manipulative nature and taken steps to protect me. I called Robert immediately, my voice shaking with excitement. I found something. Frank left me a separate trust that Lucy doesn't know about. How much? Robert asked. Almost $200,000. But that's not the important part. Frank wrote letters expressing concern about Lucy pressuring me financially. He specifically mentioned wanting to protect me from manipulation. There was a pause. Mrs. Hartwell, this could change everything. If your husband foresaw this exact situation and took steps to protect you, it suggests he didn't expect you to use your primary assets for David's family. There's more, I continued, reading from Frank's notes. He wrote that he specifically told David the main inheritance was meant to help him get started, not to create ongoing financial dependence. Frank expected David to be self-sufficient. Robert's voice grew more animated. Can you bring all of this to my office today? We need to analyze every document. At Robert's office that afternoon, we spread Frank's papers across his desk like pieces of a puzzle. The picture that emerged was of a man who'd loved his family, but understood the importance of boundaries. Look at this, Robert said, pointing to a specific passage. Your husband wrote that he discussed financial independence with David directly. He told your son that the inheritance was a foundation, not a lifetime support system. I remember that conversation, I said. Frank was worried that giving David too much would make him dependent. He wanted him to build his own success. This establishes that your husband's estate plan was specifically designed to promote independence, not ongoing support. It directly contradicts the idea that you were expected to continue funding David's lifestyle. But the most damning evidence came in a letter Frank had written but never sent, addressed to David and dated just weeks before his death. In it, Frank expressed concern about Lucy's spending habits and her apparent expectation that family money would always be available to solve their problems. David, the letter read, "I love you and I want the best for your family, but I'm concerned about Lucy's attitude toward money and family obligations. She seems to view our resources as an extension of your income, rather than understanding that each generation must build its own foundation. Please remember that your mother's security must come first. She has sacrificed enough." Reading those words, I felt Frank's presence in the room. He'd known. He'd seen what was coming and tried to protect me, even from beyond the grave. Robert leaned back in his chair, a slight smile on his face for the first time since I'd met him. "Mrs. Hartwell, this documentation doesn't just help your case. It transforms it. We can argue that your husband's estate planning specifically anticipated and provided against the very demands Lucy is making. But what about the witnesses? What about their testimony that I made promises? That's where this gets interesting. If we can establish that your husband explicitly planned against ongoing financial support, it becomes much harder to argue that you would have made promises contradicting his wishes. It suggests that any statements you made were general expressions of love, not specific financial commitments." For the first time in weeks, I felt hope stirring in my chest. Frank had always been protective of me, always thinking ahead. I should have known he wouldn't leave me vulnerable. "There's something else," Robert continued, studying the trust documents. "This separate trust was structured specifically to be protected from family claims. Your husband worked with an estate attorney to ensure these funds couldn't be accessed by anyone else, even in cases of family pressure or legal challenges. He really thought of everything, didn't he?" "He did. And Mrs. Hartwell, there's one more thing that could be crucial. According to these documents, Lucy and David received detailed information about your husband's estate plan when he died. They knew about the trust structure and the specific provisions for your independence." My mouth went dry. They knew. If they received copies of the estate documentation, then they knew your husband had specifically provided for your security and independence. That makes their current demands even more problematic legally. I thought back to the weeks after Frank's funeral, the meetings with the attorney, the paperwork David had helped me sort through. Had he seen these documents? Had Lucy? "We need to subpoena the estate attorney's records," Robert said. "If we can prove they knew about your husband's specific intentions regarding your financial independence, their lawsuit becomes not just unfounded, but potentially fraudulent." As I left Robert's office that day, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks: the solid ground of truth beneath my feet. Frank had known this day might come, and he'd prepared for it. He'd protected me the only way he could, with careful planning and documentation that would speak for him when he couldn't. But I also felt a deep sadness. Lucy and David hadn't just betrayed me. They'd betrayed Frank's memory and his clear wishes for our family. They'd taken his love and generosity and twisted it into something ugly and grasping. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, I believed I might actually win it. The call came at 7 in the morning, 3 days before the trial was set to begin. I was having my coffee, trying to calm my nerves, when Robert's excited voice crackled through the phone. "Mrs. Hartwell, you need to sit down. I've been digging into Lucy's background, and what I found is going to blow this case wide open." My heart hammered against my ribs. "What did you find?" "Lucy Morrison isn't her real name. Her maiden name was Lucy Brennan, and she has a history. 3 years before she married David, she was involved in a similar situation with an elderly man in Oregon. She convinced him to change his will, leaving her a substantial inheritance, then disappeared right after he died." I nearly dropped my coffee cup. "Are you saying she's done this before?" "Mrs. Hartwell, I'm saying she's a professional. The Oregon case never went to trial because the man's family settled out of court, but I found the police reports. Lucy had convinced him she was in love with him, moved in as his caregiver, and systematically isolated him from his family while gaining control of his finances." My mind reeled. "But she was married to David by then." "No, she wasn't. The timeline is crucial here. Lucy was involved with this elderly man, Harold Brennan, no relation, just coincidence of names, right up until his death. She collected $150,000 from his estate, then disappeared. 6 months later, she surfaced in our area and met David. I sank deeper into my kitchen chair, trying to process what Robert was telling me. She targeted David? It looks that way. And Mrs. Hartwell, there's more. I've been in contact with Harold Brennan's nephew in Oregon. He says Lucy had a very specific pattern. She would identify men with assets, gain their trust, and then systematically work to access their money. When family members got suspicious, she'd create legal pressure to force settlements. Just like she's doing to me. Exactly like she's doing to you. But here's the thing. The nephew kept detailed records of everything Lucy did. He has documentation of her methods, her lies, even recordings of some of their conversations where she admits to manipulating the situation. I felt dizzy. She admitted it? Not directly, but close enough. In one recording, she laughs about how easy it was to convince Harold that his family didn't care about him. She talks about playing the long game and making sure she'd be set for life after he died. The woman I tried so hard to accept as family, the mother of my grandchildren, was a con artist. Everything about her relationship with David, her insertion into our family, had been calculated and deliberate. Robert, does David know any of this? There was a pause. That's the heartbreaking part, Mrs. Hartwell. I don't think he does. Looking at the timeline, Lucy was very careful to create a completely new identity when she moved here. She told David her family was dead, that she had no past relationships of significance. He fell in love with the fiction. I thought about my son, about how he'd changed after marrying Lucy. He'd become more distant from me, more focused on money and status. I'd attributed it to normal growth, to a man prioritizing his new family. But what if it had been manipulation all along? There's something else, Robert continued. I've been examining the mortgage documents Lucy presented to you. The signatures are suspicious. I had a handwriting expert look at them, and he believes several of the signatures were forged, including David's. She forged David's signature? It appears so, which means David might not have been as involved in this scheme as we thought. She may have been planning to take the money and disappear, leaving him holding the bag just like she did in Oregon. That afternoon, Robert and I drove to the Oregon contact's location to meet with Harold Brennan's nephew, Michael. He was a man in his 50s, retired from law enforcement, and he'd been tracking Lucy's activities for years. I knew she'd surface again, Michael told us, sitting in his living room surrounded by boxes of documentation. People like Lucy don't just stop. They find new targets and repeat the pattern. He showed us photos from Harold's final months. Lucy appeared in dozens of them, always touching Harold's arm, always smiling sweetly at the camera. In the later photos, Harold looked frail, confused, almost fearful. She isolated him completely, Michael explained. First, she convinced him that I was only interested in his money. Then she started spreading lies about other family members. By the end, Harold wouldn't take calls from anyone except Lucy. How did she meet him? I asked. Church. She specifically targeted the church Harold attended, befriended several elderly members, then focused on Harold because he was the wealthiest and most lonely. She played the poor young woman struggling to get by, and Harold's protective instincts kicked in. Michael pulled out a recording device. This is from a conversation between Lucy and her friend, recorded about a month before Harold died. Lucy didn't know Harold's caregiver was still loyal to the family and had started documenting things. He pressed play, and Lucy's voice filled the room. But it was different from the Lucy I knew. This voice was harder, calculating, filled with contempt. The old fool actually thinks I care about him, Lucy's voice said, followed by cruel laughter. He's changed his will 3 times now, each time giving me more. By the time he dies, I'll have everything, and his precious family won't get a dime. My stomach turned. This was the woman who'd sat at my dining room table, who'd held my grandchildren, who'd told me I should die in peace. Harold's death was convenient for her, Michael continued. Natural causes, but the timing was perfect. She just convinced him to sell his house and put the money in a joint account with her name on it. What happened to the money? She cleaned out the accounts within a week of his death, before we could freeze them. Then she disappeared completely. It took us 6 months to track her down, And by then she changed her name and started over. Robert looked up from his notes. Michael, would you be willing to testify? Would you be willing to travel to our trial and tell the court about Lucy's pattern of targeting elderly people? I've been waiting years for this chance, Michael said grimly. Harold was a good man. He didn't deserve what she did to him. And I'm sure your mother-in-law doesn't deserve it either. On the drive back, Robert was quiet for a long time. Finally, he spoke. Mrs. Hartwell, this changes everything. Lucy isn't just a greedy daughter-in-law. She's a predator who specifically targets older people with assets. What she's doing to you is her profession. But what about David? What about my grandchildren? That's the tragic part. David is as much a victim as you are. Lucy has been manipulating him for years, probably turning him against you gradually while positioning herself to access your resources. The children are just props in her scheme. I stared out the car window at the familiar landscape of my hometown, thinking about how Lucy had inserted herself into our family, how she'd slowly changed the dynamics, how she'd created distance between David and me, while positioning herself as the primary influence in his life. She's been planning this for years, hasn't she? Since the day she met David. Maybe even before, if she was already researching potential targets in this area. That night, I sat in Frank's chair in our living room, surrounded by photos of our life together. In some of the later ones, Lucy appeared with David and the children. Looking at them now, I could see what I'd missed before. Lucy's smiles never quite reached her eyes when she was looking at Frank or me. Her body language was always slightly distant, as if she was acting a part rather than living it. Frank had seen it. That's why he'd written those letters, why he'd created the separate trust, why he'd worried about my financial security. He'd recognized that Lucy was dangerous, even if he couldn't prove it at the time. Tomorrow, we would present our evidence to the court. We would expose Lucy for what she really was. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the real tragedy wasn't what she tried to do to me. The real tragedy was what she'd already done to my son, and what it would mean for those precious grandchildren when the truth finally came out. The courthouse felt like stepping into a mausoleum. Cold marble floors echoed with every footstep, and the high ceilings seemed designed to make you feel small and powerless. I sat beside Robert at the defendant's table, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my knuckles had turned white. Across the aisle, Lucy sat with her attorney, a sharp-faced woman in an expensive suit who'd probably cost more than my entire legal budget. Lucy had dressed perfectly for the occasion. A modest navy dress, minimal makeup, her hair pulled back in a simple style that made her look younger and more vulnerable. She kept dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, the picture of a wronged daughter-in-law fighting for her family's survival. David sat in the gallery behind her, and seeing him there felt like a knife twisting in my chest. My own son, prepared to testify against me. He wouldn't meet my eyes when I turned around, just stared straight ahead with the same distant expression he'd worn since this nightmare began. Judge Patricia Morgan entered, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and intelligent eyes. She surveyed the courtroom with the kind of calm authority that came from decades of sorting through human drama and deception. We're here today for Morrison versus Hartwell, she announced. This is a civil action for breach of oral contract and unjust enrichment. Ms. Patterson, you may present your opening statement. Lucy's attorney stood with practiced grace. Your Honor, this is a simple case about a grandmother who made promises to her family and is now trying to break them. Mrs. Lucy Morrison and her husband David trusted Mrs. Phyllis Hartwell when she repeatedly assured them that she would provide financial support for their future. Based on those promises, they purchased a family home, believing that Mrs. Hartwell would honor her commitments. Now, Mrs. Hartwell is trying to abandon her family obligations, leaving a young mother and two small children financially devastated. Ms. Patterson gestured toward Lucy, who managed to look both dignified and heartbroken. We will show that Mrs. Hartwell made specific, repeated promises of financial support. We will demonstrate that my client relied on those promises to her detriment. And we will prove that Mrs. Hartwell has the means to honor her commitments, but is choosing not to out of selfishness and spite. When Robert stood for his opening statement, he looked like David facing Goliath. But his voice was steady and confident. Your Honor, this case is not about a grandmother breaking promises to her family. This case is about a calculated scheme to defraud an elderly woman of her life savings. We will show that the plaintiff, Lucy Morrison, is not who she claims to be. We will demonstrate that she has a documented pattern of targeting elderly people with assets and manipulating them through legal pressure. And we will prove that far from making the promises alleged, Mrs. Hartwell was specifically warned by her late husband to protect herself from exactly this kind of financial manipulation. I watched Lucy's face during Robert's statement. For just a moment, her carefully composed mask slipped, and I saw something cold and calculating flash in her eyes before she quickly resumed her performance of wounded innocence. The prosecution's case began with David taking the stand. Watching my son walk to the witness box, raise his right hand, and swear to tell the truth felt like attending my own funeral. "Mr. Hartwell," Ms. Patterson began, "please tell the court about your mother's promises regarding financial support for your family." David's voice was flat, rehearsed. "My mother repeatedly told my wife and me that she wanted to help us build a secure future for our children. She said that family should take care of family, and that she wanted to make sure we had everything we needed." "Did she make specific commitments about the farm property?" "She knew we were looking at houses and said she wanted to help make sure we could afford something suitable for raising the children. When we found the farm, she said it was perfect and that she was glad she could contribute to securing our future there." Each word felt like a betrayal, but I forced myself to listen. This was my son, the boy I'd raised, the man I'd sacrificed everything for, and he was twisting my words of love into evidence of legal obligation. "Did your mother ever express any reservations about providing this support?" "No. She was enthusiastic about helping us. She said she couldn't think of a better use for her money than investing in her grandchildren's future." Ms. Patterson smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Hartwell." Robert's cross-examination was gentle but pointed. "Mr. Hartwell, when your father died, did you receive detailed information about his estate plan?" David shifted uncomfortably. "We received some paperwork, yes." "Did that paperwork include information about a separate trust established specifically for your mother's financial security?" "I don't remember all the details." "Did your father ever discuss with you his expectation that you would be financially independent after receiving your inheritance?" David's jaw tightened. "My father wanted the best for all of us." "That's not what I asked, Mr. Hartwell. Did your father specifically tell you that your inheritance was meant to help you become self-sufficient, not to create ongoing dependence on family money?" Yes, he mentioned something like that." "So you were aware that your father had specifically designed his estate plan to promote your independence, not ongoing financial support from your mother?" David glanced at Lucy, then back at Robert. "I suppose so." The other witnesses followed the same pattern. Margaret, David's cousin, testified about conversations at the family reunion. Bob, our neighbor, described my alleged promises about supporting the family's future. Each testimony was carefully crafted to support the narrative of a grandmother making specific financial commitments. But Robert's cross-examination began to poke holes in their stories. Margaret admitted she'd only spoken to me briefly at the reunion and might have misunderstood the context. Bob acknowledged that his conversations with me had been casual, neighborly chat rather than formal financial discussions. Then Lucy took the stand, and I watched her transform into the perfect victim. She spoke in a soft, trembling voice about trusting me, about believing in my promises, about the devastation of realizing I was going to abandon my family. "Mrs. Morrison," Ms. Patterson asked, "can you describe the conversation where Mrs. Hartwell committed to helping with the mortgage payments?" Lucy dabbed at her eyes. "She called me into her dining room and said she'd been thinking about our future. She said she wanted to make sure David and I could give the children everything they deserved, and that she was ready to take on the financial responsibility for our housing costs. She said it would give her peace of mind knowing she was securing her grandchildren's future." It was a complete fabrication, but delivered with such sincerity that I could see some of the jurors nodding sympathetically. "How did you feel when Mrs. Hartwell later refused to honor these commitments?" "Devastated. Betrayed. I couldn't understand how someone could make such promises to their own family and then simply change their mind. We'd already committed to the purchase based on her assurances." Robert's cross-examination was where everything changed. "Mrs. Morrison, is Lucy Morrison your real name?" Lucy blinked, clearly caught off guard. What do you mean? I mean, were you born Lucy Morrison? Or did you change your name at some point? Miss Patterson jumped up. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance. I'll allow it, Judge Morgan said, leaning forward with interest. Mrs. Morrison, isn't it true that your maiden name was Lucy Brennan, and that you were involved in a similar legal dispute in Oregon 3 years before you married Mr. Hartwell? Lucy's face went pale. I don't know what you're talking about. Isn't it true that you convinced an elderly man named Harold Brennan to change his will in your favor, then collected over $100,000 from his estate before disappearing? Objection. Miss Patterson's voice was sharp with panic. Your Honor, Robert said calmly, this goes directly to the plaintiff's credibility and pattern of behavior. I'll allow it. Please answer the question, Mrs. Morrison. Lucy's carefully composed mask was cracking. That was a different situation entirely. Harold was... We had a relationship. A relationship where you convinced him to disinherit his family in favor of you. Correct? It wasn't like that. Robert pulled out a transcript. Mrs. Morrison, I have here a recording of you discussing Harold Brennan. Would you like me to play it for the court? The color drained completely from Lucy's face. In the gallery, I saw David's expression change from confusion to horror as he began to understand what was happening. Your Honor, Ms. Patterson said desperately, we request a recess. But it was too late. The mask had fallen away, and everyone in that courtroom could see Lucy Morrison for exactly what she was. Judge Morgan's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Mrs. Morrison, before we proceed further, I have one simple question for you. Lucy sat frozen in the witness chair, her performance finally and completely shattered. And I knew that whatever the judge asked next would determine not just the outcome of this trial, but the future of my entire family. Judge Morgan leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Lucy with the intensity of someone who had seen every kind of deception in her years on the bench. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Mrs. Morrison, she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. If this mortgage is legitimately yours and your husband's responsibility, and Mrs. Hartwell never actually signed any documents or made any legally binding commitments, then can you explain to me why Mrs. Hartwell's name appears as a co-signer on the original mortgage application documents you submitted as evidence? The question hung in the air like a trap finally springing shut. Lucy's mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. Behind her, I heard Miss Patterson shuffling frantically through papers. That must be a mistake, Lucy finally whispered. Judge Morgan held up a document. This is your Exhibit A, Mrs. Morrison. The mortgage application you claim proves Mrs. Hartwell's commitment to pay for your house. Her signature appears right here, allegedly from 6 months ago. But Mrs. Hartwell testified that she never signed any such document. Robert was on his feet. Your Honor, we had that signature analyzed by a handwriting expert. It's a forgery. Furthermore, the judge continued, never taking her eyes off Lucy, if Mrs. Hartwell never agreed to be responsible for this mortgage, how did her social security number and financial information end up on these loan documents? Information that would have been necessary to process the application. Lucy's face had gone from pale to gray. In the gallery, David was staring at his wife with an expression of dawning horror. He was finally seeing what his father had recognized years ago, what I had been too blind to see until it was almost too late. Mrs. Morrison, Judge Morgan's voice was ice-cold now. Are you telling this court that someone other than you fraudulently used Mrs. Hartwell's personal information to secure this mortgage? We thought. David said his mother had agreed. Mr. Hartwell, the judge turned to David. Did you give your wife your mother's social security number and financial information? David looked stricken. No, Your Honor. I would never do that without my mother's permission. Then how did this information end up on these documents, Mrs. Morrison? The silence stretched on forever. Lucy sat in the witness chair, trapped by her own fabricated evidence, unable to explain how she'd obtained my personal information without admitting to identity theft. Ms. Patterson finally spoke up, her voice shaky. Your Honor, we request a recess to review our evidence. Denied, Judge Morgan said sharply. Mrs. Morrison, I'm asking you directly. Did you forge Mrs. Hartwell's signature on these mortgage documents? I was protecting my family, We needed help, and she had promised. That's not what I asked. Did you forge her signature? Yes or no? Lucy's composure finally cracked completely. She was supposed to help us. She led us on. We had every right to expect her support. Mrs. Morrison, you've just admitted to forgery in my courtroom. Bailiff, please place Mrs. Morrison under arrest for document fraud and identity theft. The courtroom erupted. David jumped to his feet, his face a mask of shock and betrayal. Miss Patterson was frantically trying to control the situation. But through it all, I felt a strange calm settling over me. Finally, the truth was out. As the bailiff approached Lucy, she turned to look at me with pure hatred in her eyes. You ruined everything, she screamed. You selfish old woman. This was supposed to be simple. Mrs. Morrison, Judge Morgan's voice cut through her outburst, you're the one who ruined everything. You attempted to defraud an elderly woman out of her life savings through forged documents and identity theft. You've wasted this court's time with a frivolous lawsuit based on fabricated evidence. She turned to me. Mrs. Hartwell, not only is the case against you dismissed with prejudice, but I'm recommending that the district attorney's office pursue criminal charges against Mrs. Morrison for elder fraud, identity theft, and perjury. As they led Lucy away in handcuffs, still screaming about how unfair it all was, David approached our table. His face was pale, his eyes filled with tears. Mom, he whispered. I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I thought. She told me you had agreed to everything. She showed me papers. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised and loved and nearly lost to a predator's manipulation. The anger I'd carried for weeks suddenly felt too heavy to hold on to. David, she fooled both of us. The important thing is that you see it now. He broke down then, sobbing like the little boy he'd once been. She destroyed everything. My marriage, my relationship with you, my children's stability. How could I have been so blind? Robert gathered up his papers, a satisfied smile on his face. Mrs. Hartwell, there's more good news. With Lucy's arrest, all the assets she claimed in the divorce proceedings will be frozen pending the criminal investigation. That includes the farm she bought with your forged signature. David will likely recover most of his losses. Over the following weeks, the full scope of Lucy's deception came to light. The criminal investigation revealed that she'd been planning this scheme for over a year, gradually gathering my personal information through David, researching my finances, and setting up the legal framework to steal my savings. She'd manipulated David in ways that went far beyond what any of us had realized. She'd intercepted mail from Frank's attorney, hidden documents about the estate, and fed David false information about my financial situation to make him believe I was wealthy and selfish, rather than living on a modest fixed income. The most heartbreaking discovery was a journal Lucy had kept, detailing her manipulation tactics. She'd written about isolating David from me, about creating artificial emergencies to justify financial demands, about her plan to eventually have me declared incompetent, so she could access my entire estate. She was going to have you put in a nursing home. David told me one evening as we sat in my living room, working on rebuilding our relationship. She'd already researched facilities. Once she got control of your money, I was supposed to become the responsible son who made the difficult decision to put you in care. Lucy pleaded guilty to multiple felony charges and received a 5-year prison sentence. The judge recommended she serve every day of it, calling her actions a calculated campaign of elder abuse that represents the worst kind of family betrayal. David filed for divorce immediately and was awarded full custody of Emma and little Jake. Lucy's parental rights were terminated due to her criminal conviction and the court's finding that she posed a danger to the children's welfare. 6 months after the trial, David and the children moved into a small house just 3 blocks from mine. We have dinner together every Sunday now, and the kids have sleepovers at Grandma's house every weekend. Emma, now 7, helps me tend my garden, and 4-year-old Jake likes to help me bake cookies, though he eats more dough than makes it into the oven. David is in therapy, working through the trauma of realizing that his marriage was built on manipulation and lies. He's also started a support group for other victims of financial fraud, something that gives him purpose as he rebuilds his life. As for me, I've discovered something unexpected in all of this: freedom. For years, I'd carried guilt about not being the perfect mother, about the sacrifices I'd made, about the ways I'd disappointed my family. Lucy's scheme forced me to examine my life and realize that I'd done the best I could with what I had. I used part of Frank's trust fund to help David get back on his feet, but on my terms, with clear boundaries and mutual respect. The rest remained safely protected for my future care, just as Frank had intended. Last week, I received a letter from Michael Brennan in Oregon. Lucy had finally been connected to 3 other similar schemes in different states. Her conviction was helping to bring justice for Harold and other elderly victims she'd targeted over the years. Your courage in fighting back, Michael wrote, probably saved other families from going through what we did. Thank you for not letting her win. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came last Sunday evening. Emma was helping me clean up after dinner when she looked up at me with her father's serious eyes. Grandma Phyllis, why did Lucy try to take your money? I thought carefully about how to answer. Sometimes, sweetheart, people make very bad choices because they want things that don't belong to them. But we belong to you, don't we? Me and Jake and Daddy. I knelt down and hugged her tight. Yes, Emma. You belong to me and I belong to you. That's what real family means. As I tucked the children into bed that night in my guest room, I realized that Lucy's attempt to destroy my family had actually saved it. Her greed and manipulation had forced us to confront the truth, to rebuild our relationships on solid ground, and to appreciate what really mattered. Frank had been right to worry about financial manipulation, but he'd also been right about something else. Family isn't about money or obligation or legal contracts. Family is about love, respect, and choosing to stand by each other when everything falls apart. And sometimes the best way to protect the people you love is to refuse to be a victim.